The meeting room on Station Alpha 7 felt heavy with the weight of 300 years of careful diplomacy. Ambassador Elena Vasquez stood at the podium, her weathered hands gripping the edges as she looked out at the assembled alien delegates. The Galactic Council chamber was a marvel of engineering, with seats designed for dozens of different species, each with their own environmental needs. But today the beauty of the place felt hollow to her. She had delivered reports like this one before, reports about human colonies being attacked, human ships being destroyed, human settlers being forced from their homes. Each time the response was the same: polite concern, promises of investigation, and then nothing. The other species had learned that humans were patient. They had learned that humans preferred words to weapons. What they had not learned was the difference between patience and weakness. The Zephyrian delegate, a tall being with blue-green skin and large black eyes, tapped his claws against his desk in what Elena knew was a sign of boredom. The Korvaxi representative, a creature that looked like a cross between a wolf and a lizard, was cleaning his teeth with a metal pick. Neither of them was really listening. Why would they? Humans always talked. Humans never acted. Elena pulled up the first hologram. The image showed New Geneva, a human farming colony on the edge of the hegemony border. Or rather, what was left of it. The fields that had once grown enough food to feed 500,000 people were black and dead. The storage silos were empty. The colonists were gone. 3 weeks ago, Elena began, her voice steady despite the anger burning in her chest, Korvaxi forces entered New Geneva system. They told our colonists they were conducting a routine inspection. Then they took everything. Every grain of food, every piece of equipment, every ounce of medicine. 50,000 men, women, and children were left with nothing. The Korvaxi delegate looked up from his teeth cleaning. The inspection revealed that the colony was not following proper agricultural standards, he said in his growling voice. The food was unsafe for consumption. We were protecting the galaxy from contaminated products. Elena's jaw tightened. She had heard these excuses before. Always the same pattern. Find a technical violation, claim it was for everyone's safety, take what they wanted, and leave humans to clean up the mess. She pulled up another image. This one showed the Meridian shipping lane, where human cargo vessels had been inspected so many times that trade had become impossible. In the past 6 months, she continued, human merchant ships have been boarded 47 times in what your forces call random inspections. 17 of those ships never made it to their destinations. Their crews are missing. Their cargo is gone. When we ask for investigations, we are told that space is dangerous and accidents happen. The Thakuri representative, an amphibian creature with wet, glistening skin, made a sound that was probably laughter. Perhaps humans should invest in better navigation systems, he wheezed, or stronger ships. The galaxy is not kind to the weak. Elena felt something cold settle in her stomach. She had been a diplomat for 30 years. She had negotiated trade agreements, peace treaties, and alliance documents. She had always believed that words could solve problems, that reasonable beings could find reasonable solutions. But as she looked at the faces around her, she realized that these beings were not reasonable. They were predators, and they saw humans as prey. The final hologram showed children. Human children on Kepler Station, their faces thin from hunger because Zephyrian traders had raised food prices to levels no human could afford. These children are starving, Elena said quietly. Not because there is no food in the galaxy, not because of natural disaster or system failure. They are starving because you have decided that human lives are worth less than your profits. The Zephyrian delegate shifted in his seat. Market forces determine prices, he said with what might have been a shrug. If humans cannot afford our products, perhaps they should find ways to become more economically viable. We cannot be expected to provide charity to every struggling species. Elena closed her eyes for a moment. In that darkness, she could see the faces of every human who had died while she stood in rooms like this one, asking for help that never came. She could hear the voices of children crying for food, of parents burying their young, of colonists abandoning homes they had spent decades building, all while she filed reports and made speeches and hoped that someone, somewhere, would remember that humans were people too. When she opened her eyes, she saw the truth. The other delegates were not evil. They were not monsters. They were simply practical beings who had learned that they could take what they wanted from humans without consequences. Humanity had taught them this lesson with 3 centuries of patience, restraint, and peaceful responses to violence. I have presented you with evidence of systematic attacks on human civilians, Elena said, her voice growing harder. I have shown you proof of theft, extortion, and what can only be called acts of war. What will the council do about this? The council speaker, a tall being with gray skin and 4 arms, looked at her with what might have been pity. Ambassador Vasquez, the council appreciates your concerns. We will form a committee to investigate these allegations. A report will be issued within the next standard year. In the meantime, we encourage all species to resolve their differences through peaceful dialogue. Elena stared at him. A committee, a report, peaceful dialogue. The same words they had given her last time and the time before that, and every time she had stood in this chamber begging for justice. She reached into her jacket and pulled out a small recording device. With careful movements, she placed it on the podium. This device contains the testimony of 417 human families who have lost everything to the actions of species represented in this chamber, she said quietly. Children orphaned by pirate raids that your governments ignore. Farmers driven from their homes by regulations that apply only to humans. Merchants bankrupted by inspections that happen only to human ships. They asked me to bring their voices to this place, to ask for the justice that every civilized species deserves. She picked up the device and put it back in her jacket. I have done what they asked. I have brought their voices here, and you have answered them with committees and reports and empty promises. So now I will tell you something that I hope you will remember in the days to come. The chamber had grown quiet. Even the Korvaxi had stopped cleaning his teeth. Elena looked around the room, meeting the eyes of every delegate who would look back at her. Humans are patient, she said slowly. We believe in law and order and peaceful solutions. We have spent 300 years proving this to you. But patience is not the same thing as weakness. And law and order only work when they apply to everyone equally. She gathered her papers and walked toward the door. At the threshold, she turned back. You have taught us that in this galaxy might makes right, that the strong take from the weak and the weak have no choice but to accept it. Thank you for the lesson. We will not forget it. The door closed behind her with a soft hiss. In the chamber, the delegates sat in silence for a moment before resuming their conversations. After all, what could the humans do? They were peaceful. They were civilized. They would file another report, make another speech, and continue to accept whatever the galaxy chose to give them. In her private quarters that night, Elena sent a coded message to Earth. 3 words that had been prepared for this moment. 3 words that would change everything. Diplomacy has failed. On Earth, in a bunker deep beneath the Himalayas, an old man read the message and nodded slowly. Admiral Chen Morrison had been waiting for this moment for 40 years. He turned to his aide and spoke words that had not been heard in 3 centuries. Wake the fleet. Across the Sol system, ancient machines stirred to life. In shipyards that had been dark for generations, lights began to glow. On Luna, in the asteroid belt, in orbital platforms that most of the galaxy had forgotten existed, humanity began to remember what it had chosen to forget. They were not just farmers and merchants and diplomats. They were the children of warriors, the descendants of the only species on Earth that had learned to hunt in packs and plan for tomorrow. The galaxy had spent 3 centuries teaching humanity that peace was weakness. Tomorrow, humanity would begin teaching the galaxy what war looked like when waged by a species that remembered every slight, planned for every possibility, and had been preparing for this moment since the day they first looked up at the stars and wondered what else might be out there. The age of human patience was ending. The age of human justice was about to begin. The Luna shipyards had been dark for so long that most people had forgotten they existed. Built during humanity's first expansion into space, they had once produced the ships that carried humans to the stars. But after first contact with the galactic community, they had been quietly mothballed as part of the peace agreements. Now, for the first time in 3 centuries, the massive construction bays were blazing with light. Admiral Chen Morrison walked through the central corridor, his footsteps echoing in spaces that had been silent for generations. Around him, automated systems hummed to life, following protocols that had been updated every year but never used. The air recyclers kicked in, clearing away centuries of dust. Emergency lighting switched to full operational mode. and deep in the construction bays, mechanical arms began to move with purpose. Chen paused at an observation window and looked down into Bay 7. Below him, something enormous was taking shape. The frame was already complete, a skeleton of metal and composite materials that stretched nearly 2 kilometers from nose to stern. As he watched, the automated assembly systems began adding layers of armor plating, each piece fitted with precision that only machines could achieve. Admiral. The voice belonged to Captain Sarah Kim, his second in command. She approached from behind, her tablet already displaying status reports from across the system. Bay 7 will be complete in 18 hours. Bays 3 and 5 are ahead of schedule. The asteroid mining platforms are reporting full production capacity. Chen nodded without taking his eyes off the ship below. The vessel was beautiful in the way that weapons could be beautiful, all clean lines and purposeful design. It looked nothing like the cargo haulers and passenger ships that most of the galaxy associated with humanity. This was something else entirely. This was what humans built when they stopped pretending to be peaceful. What about the stealth systems? He asked. Online and testing at 97% efficiency, Sarah replied. The Zephyrians still don't know we've solved the quantum signature problem. Their sensors won't see us coming until we're already there. Chen smiled grimly. The galaxy thought it knew human technology. They had seen human civilian ships, human trade vessels, human exploration craft. What they had not seen were the weapons that humanity had been developing in secret for 300 years. Every insult, every theft, every murdered colonist had been carefully recorded and analyzed. And from that analysis had come preparations that the galaxy could not imagine. Sir, Sarah continued, consulting her tablet, we're receiving confirmation signals from all deep cover assets. Operation Ghost Protocol is fully active. Our people are in position across 47 systems. Ghost Protocol. Chen remembered the day they had first discussed it, sitting in a conference room beneath the Pentagon while diplomats above their heads debated humanity's place in the galactic community. The plan had seemed paranoid then, preparing for a war that might never come. But Chen had lived through the unification. Wars on Earth. He knew how quickly peace could turn to violence when one side decided that the other was weak. The deep cover assets were humans who had spent decades integrating into alien societies, scientists who had studied alien technology, traders who had mapped alien supply lines, diplomats who had learned alien weaknesses. They were teachers and mechanics and shopkeepers and servants, invisible people who had spent lifetimes preparing for a day they hoped would never come. Today that day had arrived. What about Earth's defenses? Chen asked. The orbital platforms came online 6 hours ago. The planetary shield generators are at full power. If anyone tries to retaliate against the homeworld, they're going to have a very unpleasant surprise. Sarah paused, then added quietly, Sir, the President wants to know if you're sure about this. Once we begin, there's no going back. Chen was quiet for a long moment. He thought about Elena Vasquez, standing alone in that council chamber while alien delegates laughed at human suffering. He thought about the children starving on Kepler Station. He thought about the farmers of New Geneva, driven from their homes by beings who saw humans as nothing more than resources to be exploited. Captain, he said finally, do you know why humans became the dominant species on Earth? Sarah looked puzzled. Our intelligence, sir? Our ability to use tools? Chen shook his head. Lots of species are intelligent. Lots of species use tools. Humans became dominant because we learned to hunt in packs. We learned to plan for tomorrow. And most importantly, we learned to remember our enemies. He turned to face her fully. For 300 years, we've been gathering information about every species in this galaxy. We know their strengths, their weaknesses, their fears. We know where they keep their fleets, where they store their food, where they house their leaders. They think they know us, but they've only seen what we wanted them to see. Below them, the ship in Bay 7 was nearly complete. Weapon systems that existed only in classified files were being installed. Engines that could push the vessel to speeds the galaxy thought impossible were being calibrated. Hull plating that could shrug off the strongest alien weapons was being welded into place. Tell the President, Chen said quietly, that diplomacy is over. Tell him that we tried their way for 3 centuries and all it got us was dead colonists and stolen children. Tell him that humanity is done being patient. Sarah nodded and made a note on her tablet. Sir, there's one more thing. Intelligence reports that the Korvaxi are planning another raid on the Meridian colonies. 3 heavy cruisers scheduled to arrive in 36 hours. Chen smiled, and there was no warmth in it. Perfect. We'll give them a welcome they'll never forget. Captain signaled the Meridian Defense Force. Tell them to stand down and clear the area. We'll handle this ourselves. And the colonists, sir? Tell them to watch. It's time the galaxy learned what happens when you threaten human civilians. As Sarah hurried away to send the necessary orders, Chen remained at the observation window. The ship below was almost ready, its weapons charged and its crew standing by. In 12 hours, it would slip away from Luna like a ghost, invisible to every sensor in the galaxy. In 36 hours, it would reach the Meridian system just as the Korvaxi raiders arrived. The Korvaxi expected to find helpless human colonists and maybe a few lightly armed patrol ships. Instead, they would find something that had been 3 centuries in the making. They would find what humanity looked like when it stopped being patient and started being practical. Across the solar system, similar scenes were playing out. On Ceres Station, dropships designed for rapid deployment were being loaded with soldiers who had trained their entire lives for battles they had never expected to fight. In the asteroid belt, mining equipment was being converted into weapons that could crack planets. On Mars, factories that officially produced agricultural equipment were revealing their true purpose as they began manufacturing ammunition designed to penetrate alien armor. The galaxy had made a fundamental error. They had seen humanity's preference for peace and mistaken it for inability to wage war. They had seen human restraint and assumed it meant human weakness. They had 300 years to study humanity, and they had learned everything except the most important lesson. Humans were predators first and diplomats second. Chen pulled out his personal communicator and opened a channel to Earth Command. This is Admiral Morrison. Operation Reckoning is authorized. All units are cleared for immediate deployment. The response came back immediately. Confirmed, Admiral. Reckoning is a go. Good hunting. Chen closed the channel and looked out at the stars. Somewhere out there, alien species were going about their daily lives, secure in the knowledge that humans were too civilized to threaten them. Tomorrow they would wake up to a very different galaxy. Tomorrow they would learn that humanity had spent 3 centuries being patient, not because they were weak, but because they were kind. The kindness was ending. The reckoning was about to begin. At exactly Oro 800 Galactic Standard Time, the universe changed. Commander Vexitar of the Korvaxi Third Fleet was reviewing the morning reports when his flagship simply ceased to exist. One moment the bridge crew was preparing for their scheduled raid on the Meridian colonies. The next moment there was nothing but expanding plasma where 300 meters of warship had been. The explosion was so sudden and complete that the crew never had time to send a distress signal. On the Zephyrian homeworld, High Admiral Zefkul was enjoying his morning meal when every defense satellite in orbit around his planet went dark simultaneously. Not destroyed, simply turned off as if someone had flipped a switch. The planetary defense grid that had protected Zephyria for 2,000 years became silent metal, floating in space. Then the bombardment began. The weapons that struck Zephyrian military installations were unlike anything in their databases. Beams of energy that seemed to phase through shields as if they weren't there. Projectiles that moved faster than their sensors could track. Explosions that turned solid matter into fundamental particles. Within 10 minutes, the proud Zephyrian navy had been reduced to debris. In the Thakuri depths, Ambassador Glubnath was addressing the Aquatic Council when human soldiers walked through their underwater city's walls. Not through doors or airlocks, through the walls themselves, wearing suits that seemed to bend the laws of physics. The amphibians watched in terror as beings they had considered weak and primitive moved through their domain like ghosts made solid. Captain Maria Santos led the assault team through the flooded corridors of the Thakuri capital. Her suit's adaptive camouflage made her nearly invisible in the green-tinted water, and the pressure that would crush an unprotected human felt like nothing at all. Behind her, her team moved with the fluid precision of predators who had evolved to hunt in every environment their planet could offer. Target the communication centers first, she said into her helmet communicator. We don't want them warning anyone else about what's happening. Understood, Captain, came the reply from Sergeant Chen. Charges set on the main transmission tower. Ready to blow on your command. Maria reached the council chamber and saw the Thakuri delegates huddled together in obvious panic. These were the beings who had laughed at human suffering, who had called humans weak and useless. Now they cowered in their seats as water pressure alarms screamed throughout the city. Ambassador Glubneth, Maria said, her suit speakers translating her words into the wet, gurgling language of the Thakuri. You are under arrest for crimes against human civilians. The ambassador's gills fluttered in what Maria recognized as extreme distress. This is impossible, he wheezed. Your species cannot survive in our environment. Your technology is inferior. How are you here? Maria smiled inside her helmet. You spent 300 years studying us, Ambassador, but you only saw what we wanted you to see. You saw our merchants and our diplomats and our farmers. You never met our soldiers. Across the galaxy, similar scenes played out in perfect coordination. Human forces appeared in 47 systems simultaneously, striking with precision that defied everything the galaxy thought it knew about human capabilities. Ships that had been invisible to every sensor suddenly materialized in orbit around major worlds. Soldiers equipped with technology that seemed to violate basic physics walked through defenses that had protected their targets for millennia. On Kepler Station, the Zephyrian traders who had been starving human children found themselves facing Commodore Elizabeth Warren and a full Marine platoon. The traders had been counting their profits from inflated food prices when the bulkhead simply melted away, revealing humans in powered armor that made them look like mechanical gods. Zefkalar Trading Consortium, Warren announced, her voice echoing through the station's corridors. You are hereby charged with economic warfare against human civilians. Your assets are forfeit and your personnel are under arrest. The lead trader, a being whose blue skin had gone pale with shock, stammered something about trade agreements and legal protections. Warren's response was to gesture to her Marines, who began efficiently cataloging every piece of equipment, every credit chip, every scrap of valuable material in the facility. Legal protections work both ways, Warren said coldly. For 3 centuries, you've ignored the legal protections that should have covered human civilians. Today, you learn what happens when the law is applied equally. In the hegemony core world's entire fleet simply vanished from existence. Ships that had terrorized human colonies for decades found themselves facing weapons that turned their shields into conductors rather than barriers. The proud hegemony navy, which had considered humans barely worth noticing, discovered that human weapons had been designed specifically to counter their defenses. Admiral Takesh of the Hegemony 4th Fleet managed to send one last transmission before his flagship joined the growing field of debris. How did they become so strong? How did we not see this coming? The answer was simple, though Takesh would never live to understand it. Humans had not become strong. They had always been strong. They had simply been choosing not to use that strength. Every insult, every theft, every murdered colonist had been carefully recorded and filed away. Every alien technology had been studied and countered. Every alien weakness had been cataloged and exploited. On Earth, in the deep command bunker beneath the Himalayas, Admiral Morrison watched the operation unfold with grim satisfaction. Status reports flowed in from across the galaxy. Target after target neutralized, objective after objective secured, enemy after enemy rendered helpless. Sir, Captain Kim reported, the Korvaxi Third Fleet has been eliminated. Zephyrian planetary defenses are down. The Thakuri capital is under our control. Total casualties on our side, 0. Morrison nodded. 0 casualties. That had been the goal from the beginning. This was not a war of conquest or revenge. This was a demonstration. A lesson taught by a species that had spent 3 centuries being patient, while their enemies mistook that patience for weakness. What about civilian populations? He asked, untouched, sir. All strikes have been limited to military and government targets. Food distribution centers on worlds where humans were being starved have been secured and are now operating at full capacity. That had been important. Humans were not monsters. They did not wage war on innocents or punish entire species for the crimes of their leaders. This was justice, not genocide. The beings who had hurt human civilians would face consequences, but the rest of the galaxy would simply learn a new reality. Humanity was no longer asking for respect. They were demanding it. Status on the Galactic Council? Morrison asked. Station Alpha 7 is under human control. All delegates have been confined to quarters pending a general assembly. Ambassador Vasquez has been asked to prepare a new address to the council. Morrison smiled. Elena had spent decades speaking to that council as a supplicant, begging for justice that never came. Tomorrow she would speak to them as the representative of the galaxy's new dominant power. The irony was not lost on him. Across the galaxy a new day was dawning. Species that had spent centuries exploiting human patience were waking up to find their military forces gone, their leaders captured, and their assumptions about reality fundamentally shattered. The humans they had dismissed as weak farmers and naive diplomats had revealed themselves to be something far more dangerous. Predators who had been choosing to be civilized. On a dozen worlds, alien children looked up at skies where human ships now maintained order. On 100 space stations, alien merchants discovered that human trade regulations were now being enforced with the same efficiency that alien regulations had once oppressed human traders. In 1,000 star systems, the law that had protected only the strong was being replaced by law that protected everyone equally. The galaxy had spent 3 centuries teaching humanity that might made right. Now humanity was teaching the galaxy what happened when the mightiest species finally decided to be right. 72 hours after the attacks began, the galaxy's greatest powers had ceased to exist as meaningful military forces. The Korvaxi hegemony, which had ruled through fear for 1,000 years, found itself reduced to a handful of patrol ships hiding in deep space. The Zephyrian Trade Consortium, whose economic manipulation had shaped galactic politics for centuries, watched helplessly as their assets were redistributed to the very people they had been exploiting. The emergency session of the Galactic Council convened in what remained of Station Alpha 7's main assembly hall. The chamber that had once hosted elegant debates between proud species now felt more like a courtroom. Human Marines stood at attention along the walls, their presence a quiet reminder that the old order had ended. Council Speaker Vorthak struggled to maintain his composure as he called the session to order. His forearms shook slightly as he activated the translation matrix, and the gray skin that marked his species had taken on an unhealthy pale shade. Around him, the surviving delegates sat in stunned silence, each one struggling to process how completely their world had changed. "The emergency session will come to order," Vorthak announced, his voice carrying none of its usual authority. "We are here to discuss the recent developments concerning human military actions across the galaxy." Developments. The word felt inadequate to describe what had happened. Entire fleets had been erased from existence. Planetary defense systems that had protected worlds for millennia had been switched off like lights. Military bases that had seemed impregnable had been occupied by human forces who moved like they had detailed blueprints of every corridor and access shaft. Ambassador Elena Vasquez rose from her seat, and the chamber fell completely silent. 3 days ago, she had stood before this same assembly as a supplicant, begging for justice that never came. Today, she stood as the representative of the galaxy's new dominant power. The transformation was not lost on anyone present. "Honored delegates," Elena began, her voice calm and measured. 3 days ago, I stood in this chamber and presented evidence of systematic attacks on human civilians. I asked for justice under galactic law. I was told that a committee would be formed to investigate. She paused, looking around the room at faces that no longer showed boredom or dismissal. Now there was only fear and desperate attention. "I am here to inform you that the committee is no longer necessary. Humanity has conducted its own investigation. We have reached our own conclusions, and we have implemented our own solutions." The Thakori delegate, one of the few surviving members of their government, leaned forward with obvious desperation. "Ambassador Vasquez, surely we can negotiate. What has been done can be undone. We can return to the previous arrangements." Elena's expression didn't change. The previous arrangements resulted in systematic oppression of human civilians. Children starved while alien traders artificially inflated food prices. Farmers were driven from their homes by regulations that applied only to humans. Merchants were murdered by pirates whose activities were ignored by those who should have stopped them. "But the economic disruption," the Zephyrian delegate began, "has already been addressed?" Elena interrupted. "Food is now flowing freely to every world where humans were being starved. Trade routes that were being extorted are now operating under fair and equal regulations. Mining colonies that were being robbed are now receiving full payment for their resources." She activated a holographic display, that showed trade statistics from across the galaxy. The numbers told a remarkable story. In just 3 days, human living standards had improved dramatically across dozens of worlds. Food distribution had become efficient and affordable. Resource extraction was generating fair profits for the extractors, rather than being stolen by intermediaries. You see, Elena continued, it turns out that when trade regulations are applied fairly to all species, everyone benefits. When food distribution is based on need rather than the ability to pay inflated prices, children don't starve. When mining rights are respected rather than ignored, colonies prosper. The Korvaxi delegate, whose species had built their empire on the systematic exploitation of weaker races, found his voice. This is impossible to sustain. You cannot police the entire galaxy. Your forces are spread too thin. Eventually you will have to withdraw and then— He fell silent as Elena smiled. It was not a pleasant expression. And then what? You'll go back to your old ways? You'll resume raiding human colonies and stealing human resources? She shook her head slowly. I'm afraid you fundamentally misunderstand our capabilities. Elena activated another display, this one showing the locations of human forces across the galaxy. The delegates stared in horror as they realized the scope of the human presence. There were human ships in every major system, human bases on strategic worlds, human monitoring stations watching every important trade route. For 300 years, Elena said quietly, you assumed that human restraint meant human inability. You saw our preference for diplomacy and mistook it for weakness. You watched us build trade relationships and cultural exchanges, never realizing that we were also building intelligence networks and strategic positions. The truth was beginning to dawn on the assembled delegates. Every human scientist who had worked in alien laboratories had been gathering intelligence. Every human trader who had negotiated agreements had been mapping supply lines. Every human diplomat who had attended cultural events had been studying alien psychology and social structures. The human teacher who instructed your children, Elena continued, was also studying your educational systems and identifying potential points of failure. The human engineer who helped design your infrastructure was also learning how to disable it if necessary. The human merchant who sold you goods was also analyzing your economic vulnerabilities. Council Speaker Vorthak slumped in his chair as the full implications became clear. You've been planning this for centuries. We've been preparing for this possibility for centuries, Elena corrected. We hoped it would never be necessary. We spent 300 years trying to find peaceful solutions to the problems your species created. But every attempt at diplomacy was met with contempt. Every plea for justice was ignored. Every effort to protect human civilians was dismissed. She walked to the center of the chamber, her footsteps echoing in the silence. You taught us that in this galaxy, strength is the only language that commands respect. You taught us that law and order only apply to those who have the power to enforce them. You taught us that the weak exist only to serve the strong. Elena stopped and turned to face the assembled delegates. Thank you for the lesson. We have learned it well. And now we are going to teach it to you. She activated a final holographic display. This one contained a simple document, humanity's terms for the new galactic order. The list was short but comprehensive. Immediate cessation of all hostile actions against human civilians, full reparations for 3 centuries of theft and oppression, acceptance of human authority in all matters of galactic law and order. You have 24 hours to formally accept these terms, Elena announced. Any species that refuses will find their military capabilities permanently reduced to 0. Any leader who attempts to organize resistance will be removed from power. Any government that threatens human civilians will be replaced by one that understands the value of human life. The chamber erupted in desperate voices. Delegates pleaded for negotiation, for compromise, for more time. But Elena was already walking toward the exit, her human security detail falling into step behind her. She had said what needed to be said. The rest was up to them. As the doors closed behind her, the delegates sat in stunned silence. The galaxy's former powers had become its new subjects, and there was nothing they could do about it. Humanity had demonstrated that their previous restraint had been a choice, not a limitation, and now they were choosing something else entirely. Outside the chamber, Elena's aide approached with a status report. Ambassador, we're receiving surrender offers from 12 major governments. The remaining holdouts are requesting additional time to consider the terms. Elena nodded. Grant them the full 24 hours. We're not unreasonable, but make sure they understand that the deadline is absolute. She looked out through the station's observation deck at the stars beyond. Somewhere out there, human children were eating their first full meals in months. Human colonists were returning to homes they had been forced to abandon. Human merchants were conducting business without fear of piracy or extortion. The galaxy had spent 3 centuries teaching humanity that peace was for the weak. Tomorrow, humanity would begin teaching the galaxy that peace was for everyone, whether they wanted it or not. 6 months after the day that changed everything, Ambassador Kethvar of the former Zephyrian Trade Consortium sat in the waiting area outside Director General Elena Vasquez's office. The irony was not lost on him. 6 months ago, he had kept human ambassadors waiting for hours before granting them brief, dismissive audiences. Today, he was grateful for the opportunity to wait at all. Through the window of the orbital station, he could see the blue-green curve of Earth below. The planet that had once been dismissed as a minor world on the galactic periphery was now the center of all meaningful power in known space. Ships from every species in the galaxy came and went from Earth's orbital facilities, but they came as supplicants, not as equals. The waiting area itself was a study in quiet efficiency. Human staff moved with purpose, processing requests and scheduling meetings with the kind of smooth organization that had once been the envy of galactic bureaucrats. But there was a difference now. Where alien administrators had once used their power to create delays and extract concessions, human administrators seemed focused on actually solving problems. Ambassador Kethvar? A young human aide approached with a polite smile. Director General Vasquez will see you now. Kethvar rose from his seat and followed the aide through corridors that hummed with quiet activity. The walls displayed screens showing shipping schedules, resource allocation charts, and diplomatic calendars. Everything moved with a precision that the old galactic order had never achieved. Despite centuries of practice, the Director General's office was larger than any embassy Kethvar had ever seen, but it felt welcoming rather than intimidating. Elena Vasquez sat behind a desk made of earth oak, reviewing reports on a holographic display. She looked up as he entered and gestured to a chair that had been designed specifically for Zephyrian physiology. Ambassador Kethvar, Elena said with a genuine smile. Thank you for coming. I understand you have a proposal regarding the Meridian trade routes. Kethvar settled into the chair, marveling at how comfortable it was. 6 months ago, human visitors to Zephyrian facilities had been forced to stand or use furniture designed for completely different anatomies. The attention to detail was just one of many small changes that added up to a fundamentally different experience. Director General, he began carefully. The Zephyrian Merchant Council has been analyzing the new trade regulations. We believe we can increase efficiency on the Meridian routes by 20%, while reducing costs for all participants. Elena nodded thoughtfully and pulled up the relevant data. Under the old system, this conversation would have been impossible. Zephyrian traders had jealously guarded their route efficiency data, using it to maintain monopolies and extract maximum profits. Now, under human oversight, sharing such information was not just encouraged but required. Your proposal looks promising, Elena said, after reviewing the numbers. But I notice you're suggesting a shift that would reduce Zephyrian profits by 8%. Are you certain your council will approve? Kethvar's skin flushed a deeper shade of blue, the Zephyrian equivalent of embarrassment. Director General, under the old system, we would never have considered such a proposal. But we have learned that sustainable profits are better than maximum profits. When the entire trade network prospers, everyone benefits more in the long term. It was a lesson that every species in the galaxy had been forced to learn. The human approach to economics was radically different from what had come before. Instead of allowing the strongest to exploit the weakest until systems collapsed, humans had implemented what they called sustainable growth protocols. Every trade agreement, every resource allocation, every economic policy was designed to benefit all participants over the long term. The results had been remarkable. Systems that had been in economic decline for decades were now thriving. Species that had been trapped in cycles of poverty were developing sustainable industries. Even former predator races like the Korvaxi were discovering that Cooperative economics generated more wealth than predatory economics ever had. I'll approve your proposal, Elena said, making a note in her system, but I want to add a provision for profit sharing with the Meridian colonies. They've been providing raw materials at fixed prices for too long. It's time they started benefiting from the value-added processing. Kethvar nodded eagerly. 6 months ago, such a suggestion would have been met with outrage from Zephyrian traders. Now they understood that stable, prosperous trading partners were more valuable than exploited ones. It was a hard lesson, but one that had been reinforced by the absolute certainty that human oversight was not optional. As Kethvar left the meeting, he reflected on how much had changed. The galaxy was more prosperous than it had ever been, more peaceful than anyone could remember, and more fair than previous generations had thought possible. But it had taken the threat of absolute destruction to make these improvements happen. In the corridors of the station, he passed other alien delegates going about their business. There was the Thakuri representative who was discussing new underwater agriculture techniques with human engineers. The Korvaxi delegation was reviewing plans for converting their former raiding bases into peaceful mining operations. Everyone seemed busy, productive, and, most surprisingly, content. That evening, Elena stood in her private office looking out at the stars. Her aide, Commander Sarah Chen, approached with the daily status reports. Director General, we're receiving compliance reports from all major systems. Trade is up 18% from pre-integration levels. Civil conflicts are down 73%. Resource distribution efficiency has improved by 41%. Elena nodded, but her expression remained thoughtful. What about resistance movements? Down to isolated cells, mostly former military commanders who can't accept the new reality. Our intelligence networks are monitoring them, but they don't pose a significant threat. Most of their potential supporters have been won over by the economic improvements. Elena smiled. That had been the key insight from the beginning. Humans didn't want to rule through fear or oppression. They wanted to create a galaxy where everyone could prosper, where trade was fair, where conflicts were resolved through law rather than violence. The threat of overwhelming military force was simply the foundation that made everything else possible. Any word from the outer systems? She asked. The Andorian Collective has formally requested membership in the Galactic Cooperative. They're offering to share their biotechnology research in exchange for protection and trade access. Sarah paused. That makes them the 15th species to voluntarily join this month. The Galactic Cooperative. It was what the old Galactic Council had claimed to be but never actually was. A genuine partnership between species working toward common goals. Membership was voluntary, but the benefits were so obvious that most species were eager to join. Those who chose to remain independent were free to do so, as long as they didn't threaten members of the cooperative. Elena walked to her personal communication console and opened a channel to Earth. The face that appeared on the screen belonged to Admiral Morrison, now Director of Galactic Security. Despite his new title, he still preferred his Spartan military office to the grand facilities available to him. Elena, he said with a smile.
How are our former enemies adjusting to prosperity?
Better than expected, she replied. The Zephyrians are proposing efficiency improvements that will cost them profits. The Korvaxi are asking for help transitioning their warriors into productive careers. Even the Thakuri are sharing their underwater technology freely. Morrison chuckled. Turns out most beings prefer prosperity to poverty, even if it means giving up the right to exploit others. Who would have thought? Elena grew serious. Chen, do you think we did the right thing? Sometimes I wonder if we could have found another way. Morrison's expression hardened slightly. Elena, we tried another way for 300 years. We filed reports, made speeches, negotiated agreements, and begged for justice. How many human children died while we were being patient? How many families were destroyed while we were being civilized? He paused, then continued more softly. We didn't choose this path, Elena. They did with every human they killed, every colony they raided, every cry for help they ignored. We just finally decided to respond in the only language they understood. Elena nodded. He was right, of course. The galaxy was better now than it had ever been. Trade was fair, law was universal, and conflicts were resolved through negotiation rather than violence. Children of every species had enough to eat. Colonists of every race could live in safety, and merchants of every world could conduct business without fear. It had just taken the galaxy's most patient species, finally losing their patience to make it happen. As she closed the communication channel, Elena reflected on the lessons of the past 6 months. The galaxy had learned that humanity's previous restraint had been a choice, not a weakness. They had learned that sustainable cooperation was more profitable than predatory exploitation. Most importantly, they had learned that law and order worked best when they applied to everyone equally. The age of human patience was over. The age of human justice had begun.